Welcome to the Roy Green Show podcast.
64% of Canadians support mandatory COVID-19 vaccination. That's 64% of Canadians, two-thirds, supporting mandatory vaccination. Darrell Bricker is the president and CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs. They did the polling for Global News. Darrell's also the author of Next, You Know What I Say. That is the book that belongs in every household in this country. If you're staying home, if you're keeping to yourself during this COVID time, read Next by Darrell Bricker. It'll tell you what's going to happen next in this country. Darrell, thank you for the time. So we have 64%, two-thirds of the population of this country, leaning in favor of mandatory vaccination. Is that number climbing?
Yeah, it's up about 5 points since the last time we asked it in November. But what's really interesting, right, is that when we ask people, would you line up for a vaccine tomorrow? That's now 74% of Canadians, which is up 20 points since the last time that we asked it in November. So it's an interesting situation where the gap between the people who would say that we need mandatory vaccines and people who are already going to do it anyway, is that number of people is actually higher than the percentage that support mandatory vaccines.
Yeah, and it's tough to get 74% of Canadians to agree on anything. It would be tough to get 74% of Canadians to agree that today is Saturday.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. And that number continues to climb. And the reason it's going to continue to climb is that as long as the experience that people who have been the first in line to get vaccines continues to be positive, more and more people are going to come on side. And when you really look at the actual hardcore group of people who say, not under any circumstances am I going to get a vaccine, it's around 10% of the population.
Now, men are more willing, I see from the polling that you've done at Ipsos for Global News, men are more willing than women to take the vaccine without hesitation. Why is that?
When it comes to anything related to risk, men are always a little bit more willing to try something new. So, for example, if you ask them, every cause that you can have, for taking risk in your life that could shorten your life, men are more willing to do it than women. And when it comes to things like healthcare, they tend not to care as much about what the potential negative side effects are going to be. So no, I wasn't surprised when I saw that number.
Another number that I found very interesting is the percentage of Canadians who actually believe the vaccine will slow the spread of COVID. That number was lower than I thought it would be.
Yeah, and the reason is because they haven't seen it actually have the effect. And this is something that's really interesting that's happening out there in the environment right now, Roy, is that people are watching the news more than they used to. They're paying really close attention to what's going on, particularly as it pertains to COVID-19. And if they all of a sudden start to see news stories that show that the numbers are coming back down rather than going up, then they'll probably start attributing that to a certain extent to people becoming vaccinated. And that's when you'll see those numbers move in the other direction.
Okay, now looking at another short paragraph here in the Global News story, according to the Ipsos survey, which was conducted earlier this month, 13% think their turn will come by the September target, which Justin Trudeau talks about repeatedly, while 19% believe they'll have access to the vaccine before the end of March, and 18% of Canadians think they'll not be eligible to receive the vaccine this year. So all those three numbers are below 20%.
Yeah, and when you start to add them up, though, it starts to look more like around a majority of Canadians are thinking that they're going to get access to the vaccine sometime around June. Now, the government has said that obviously we're all going to be vaccinated by sometime in the fall. So they've kind of arbitrarily set that date as being the acceptable date. And particularly when people were a little more reluctant about taking the vaccine, that was probably acceptable. But now that people are starting to see the success, they're actually seeing the marker for how fast a population can be vaccinated being set by other countries, that they'll start to adjust their expectations. So what I'm expecting to see is that fall date will become more difficult to defend for the government, and it could become problematic for them.
Yeah, that's what you and I have talked about in the past. You've told me that over the last couple of weeks, that if the government doesn't meet its own projections, which it trumpets loudly, and between 7 and 8 million Canadians are standing with sleeve rolled up, ready to be vaccinated, if they don't meet that September promise, it's going to be really problematic for them.
Yeah, and especially that 7 to 8 million number is now, if you take that 72% number, has now climbed up something more than 25 million Canadians.
Yeah.
So it's really jumped.
So 12%, though, Daryl, you find still say they will not be vaccinated. Does that surprise you?
Yeah, and I'm putting the number probably closer to about 1 in 10, because there are some people among that 12 that probably will get peeled off as we see more success with vaccines. But no, I mean, I'm from the very beginning on this, looking at the numbers, I think that there has been an inordinate amount of obsession, particularly among people in the media, people in the the academic community, and the government community, the public sector community, about for want of a better term, anti-vaxxers. That there was a huge groundswell of opposition to vaccination. It was never big. There was a lot of people who were conditional because they needed to see some early experience that would be successful, and they would come on. But that true anti-vaxxer crowd is actually quite small and is not going to drive this issue.
Okay, small but vocal.
Small but vocal. And, small but vocal groups are, they're not to be ignored. But 90% of the population actually feels another way. Yeah. And 90% vaccination for anything these days is way beyond what we normally have for vaccination.
Yeah. There are many things that are being done or being suggested by governments. And increasingly the question is, do they have the right to do that? Can they constitutionally do that? Are they in violation of the Charter? Do emergency situations provide them the opportunity and the right to make the decisions they're making? We've talked about this with Michael Bryant, the Executive Director of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. And during the first wave of the pandemic, Mr. Bryant told us very early on that one of his concerns is that it may become more easy, or will become more easy, for politicians to pass legislation that might compromise our rights as they go along. The first time is more difficult than the second time. So let's talk to the Executive Director of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association about the stay-at-home orders, about curfews, about British Columbia's possible travel, interprovincial travel restrictions, mandatory vaccinations, and the like. Mr. Bryant, good to have you back on the show. How are you?
Good to be here. Thanks.
So let me start with this. We just talked to Daryl Bricker of Ipsos, and 64% of Canadians told Ipsos for Global News that they are now in favor of mandatory vaccination. Would you have, at the CCLA, would you have huge concerns if any government, federal or provincial, were to say, this is what we're going to do, it's going to be mandatory?
Oh, yeah, of course. We don't have any, we've never mandated medical treatment under Canadian law ever for anything. Except in circumstances where there's due process in a hearing. So I've been at those hearings where a judge decides whether or not the circumstances are appropriate for somebody to receive mandatory treatment because they're a danger to themselves and others. And it's a serious hearing, and that's for one person. To require by law that the state gets to put a needle in your arm is something that is extreme, So but that said, I obviously understand what the point is of it, and furthermore, I think we were that before one could even consider that, we need to see how many people actually want to get vaccinated and do get vaccinated, and if it's anything like the other vaccinations that we have in Canada, we'll hit the herd immunity amount that we need to hit without much difficulty. We'll get to 80%, 90% of the population. And from a public health perspective, as I understand it, that's what the science is trying to get at. It's more about getting to a certain point and achieving herd immunity than it is about getting 100% compliance.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Bricker pointed out to us that even though the news story indicates 64%, in the interim, it's gone to 72% of Canadians in favor of mandatory vaccination. Let me ask you for your thoughts, and you tweeted out on this as well. The stay-at-home order, which was put in place by the Ford government in Ontario, the Quebec 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. curfew put in place by the Legault government, and you questioned, if I remember your tweet correctly, you questioned the legality of these moves. Do you have concerns, and if so, what are they?
Not with the orders per se. I think on paper they're fine, and the Ontario order is better than the Quebec order. For every law, we do the same thing. We ask ourselves two questions: is it necessary, and is it proportionate in the event that it impacts on a constitutional right? Well, both these laws impact on the constitutional right to liberty, and also affect things like religious freedom if it denies worship. So in the case of both, we would say it's necessary, although with the Quebec curfew, one has to say there is no evidence showing that most people get COVID at night. So why are you putting in place a curfew if you don't have evidence that people are getting curfew at night? Well, I think their answer to that would be, well, we don't have that, but what we're trying to do is get people at home more, and this does that. And so, in that sense, it probably meets the necessity test, the curfew, and the stay-at-home order. And then it really boils down to proportionality, and have they tried to carve out exceptions and limit constitutional rights in a way that's proportionate? I think the answer is, on paper, yes. So our concern actually with both Ontario and Quebec is not with the law per se, it's how it's going to be enforced. And thus far, it seems that Ontario is trying to avoid overzealous policing and ticketing of people, whereas Quebec, we're getting stories, and we're encouraging people to go up on our website and report what they feel a bad ticket is on a form that we've got ready for people to fill out. We've got some stories of ticketing in Quebec, which isn't going to do anything to aid public health. All it's going to do is heap fines on, for example, homeless people who can't even pay the fines.
Yeah. So I was going to ask you, what is there one story in particular that stands out?
Well, ticketing homeless people stands
ridiculous.
Out. Ticketing, somebody received a ticket. They had a doctor's note, and the note said the person had an appointment to go to a supervised injection site at 9 p.m. Now, I understand there may be some people who disagree with supervised injection sites. It's a harm reduction approach, and not everybody is a believer in it. But nevertheless, they had a doctor's note that allowed them to go there at 9 p.m., and the police officer tore up the note. Another instance in which police will pull someone over, this is in Quebec, and then try and search the entire vehicle. Now, that's under those circumstances, they're pulling them over for public health purposes, and then they do the search because they're really fishing around to see if there's narcotics, and that's a violation of their charter rights. So it really comes down to, whether or not the enforcement officers are really engaged in public health prevention, or are they, trying to rack up their ticket numbers? And the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police advice for these COVID offenses in Quebec and Ontario and elsewhere across Canada is police and enforcement officers should be educating the public first, warning the public second, and only as a matter of last resort, ticketing them. In Quebec, they seem to be doing the reverse of that. And in Ontario, it seems as if they're taking that approach, and the same applies in Western Canada. Quebec and Eastern Canada just take a different approach. They seem to be ticketing everything. And our view is, based just on the stats and the science, is you actually can't ticket your way out of a pandemic. You need to build public trust and keep public trust in place. And it's not going to be tickets and deterrence that do the trick.
Having lived in Quebec for 9 years, recently, I can absolutely agree with you that ticketing everything is SOP there, standard operating procedure. And it's not good at this time because people are already fearful. People are already concerned. Let me ask you this. You know that the Premier of British Columbia, Mr. Horgan, seems to be in favor of interprovincial travel restrictions and is investigating whether or not he and his government have the right to proceed. What do you say?
That affects a constitutional right. It's the mobility right. It's one of the reasons that we became a country in the first place, is that we felt that we could do more together than we could apart as separate provinces and colonies. It's also under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So, governments have to take it seriously. So you ask yourselves, is it necessary? And then is there another way to do it? And to cut to the chase, the way in which you make it proportionate, I would have thought, is you put in place a quarantine requirement. So if somebody comes into BC, they have to quarantine for a period of time. If that's not working, then I could understand a government looking at a travel ban. But BC doesn't have such a thing. A provincial quarantine would be an example of a more proportionate way of restricting mobility rights.
All right.
And that, of course, presumes that you actually have a mobility problem. Do they really have that many people coming into BC
good point.
that are causing infections to go up? And I don't know the answer to that question.
The website is ccla.org, right?
Yeah, thank you very much. If people want more information on what I've talked about, or they want to tell us about a bad ticket, please go on to ccla.org. Just scroll down a bit, and you'll see the link to COVID, to our COVID page, and there's a place there to report your bad ticket to us.
Okay. I think we're realizing now, perhaps more than many other times, how important it is to have the Civil Liberties Association acting as watchdog for what's going on and enshrining, or at least defending, the charter rights and constitutional rights of Canadians. Professor Sylvain Charlebois joins us. He wrote an op-ed in the Spectator, Hamilton Spectator, and the headline is, Carbon Tax Could Lead to Food Insecurity for Canadians. And Professor Charlebois is the Senior Director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab and a professor in food distribution and policy at Dalhousie University. The professor has joined us on this program in the past. Professor Charlebois, thank you for coming back on the show.
My pleasure.
So I'm going to read just a couple of lines from the top of your op-ed and then ask you to comment. COVID-19 has had an impact on Canada's food industry, but over time resilience will prevail. However, the federal government's pre-holiday announcement that it will increase the carbon tax to $170 per ton by 2030 will have a long-term impact on consumers. Climate change is a real and significant problem. We need to act quickly, and the carbon tax seems to provide a simple and fair solution. The Trudeau government is clearly committed to a carbon tax now. This tax is essentially aimed at penalizing polluters. It's a good idea in principle, but it's short-sighted in many ways. So, can we start with the farmers and how it's going to affect them?
Yeah, it's unknown for most people who live in cities. Farmers are price takers. They don't really control much of anything from a market perspective. And so when they're asked to absorb more costs, it's always difficult for them to pass on any extra cost to the next level. In their case, it would be processing, grain handling, etc. So they're really stuck when you understand their role within the supply chain. So at $50 per metric ton, which is where we're going right now. In 2022, the carbon tax will be set at $50 a metric ton. The amount is significant for farmers, but for city dwellers, it's still, I would say, at a level where they would probably tell farmers to pardon the expression, but suck it up, because it is about climate change. It is about matching our commitment to the Paris Agreement, and so on and so forth. But before the holidays, what really got me thinking is when the Prime Minister Trudeau, announced, that was on December 10th, I believe, all of a sudden, as a surprise, and nobody was really ready for that, he announced that his government is committed to increase the carbon tax to $170 per metric ton by 2030. Now, to me, when I heard that, I would say that it changes a lot of things. It becomes a completely different conversation.
Yeah, and you're right as well. In your op-ed, producers can't increase their prices. If we go beyond the farmers for a moment, producers, and they are, I guess, can't increase their prices even if production costs increase on the farm. So back to the farmers. they can't increase their prices because there's only so much that consumers can afford to pay. So it's catch-22, right?
That's right. Now, every year we publish Canada's Food Price Report with the University of Guelph, the University of Saskatchewan, and the University of British Columbia. And this year, of course, we released our study, I think it was 2 days before the Prime Minister made its announcement on the carbon tax, and we were announcing to Canada that prices are going to go up 3 to 5% in 2021. And a lot of people, especially farmers, were telling us, well, it's because of the carbon tax. Now, it's very difficult to demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that the carbon tax itself is actually going to impact food prices. It could, but it's hard to prove, it's hard to demonstrate. But $170, when all functions of the supply chain are going to be exposed to this tax at $170, it's very difficult at this point not to see how the carbon tax won't have an impact on food inflation eventually. $170 is a lot.
It is a lot. And you also pointed out in your study in December, and we talked to you at that time, that in the coming year, I think the amount, the extra that a Canadian family was going to be paying for food in 2021 was about $700, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So now, do we add the carbon tax? I mean, I know it's $50 a metric ton now, but does that get added to the $700?
No. You see, it's a hidden tax, really. All companies have to report and have to absorb this tax, whatever they do. Whether you're a farmer, a processor, a distributor, you have to really pay that tax. Now, eventually, it will catch up to consumers. Now, historically, not all extra costs do impact consumers. Sometimes you'll see, say, the minimum wage increase across a province, and it won't necessarily impact food prices at retail. It really depends. However, there are exceptions. For example, in Ontario a few years ago, if you remember, with the Wynne government, when they decided to increase the minimum wage to $15 overnight, or I believe it was $14 overnight, an increase of 22%. Well, for the supply chain to absorb that was almost impossible. So we did see an impact on food prices very immediately.
Yeah.
But it was absorbed a few months later, and things stabilized. But the carbon tax is going to stick around. It's going to stay there for a very long time.
And it affects so many sectors, does it not? So it's inevitable that it's going to drive prices up. So if I can take this back to the point of your op-ed, and that is carbon tax could lead to food insecurity for Canadians. Those words, food insecurity for Canadians, will resonate.
Absolutely. Now, a lot of people probably are listening to us and say, well, this is the cost to save the environment. And it's true. I mean, at some point, we want to make sure that we make our supply chain responsible. But think about global markets. If we are to impose to our farmers, processors, and everyone within the supply chain, impose a tax of $170 per metric ton, well, what about imported food? You're basically making imported food more competitive, not less competitive, and they're not going to be exposed to a carbon tax. So, again, the carbon tax itself is, I think, a good idea. It's a simple idea. It can work, but how it's being implemented, it's very dangerous for farmers and for consumers as well.
Yeah, and that's the spectrum. The consumer,
absolutely,
right? The producer and the consumer.
The continuum are going to be heavily penalized by a carbon tax if Ottawa doesn't really look at this very seriously, assessing the impact.
And we're already heavily taxed. We already live in a national constituency. We keep repeating this, where we were told last October that 49% of Canadians are within $200 of not being able to pay their monthly bills already. This was before COVID. So now in the middle of the pandemic, Mr. Trudeau suddenly pulls this rabbit out of his hat and says by 2030 it's going to be $170 a metric ton. People start to plan for 2030. People who are in business or in producing, they start to plan for 2030 and 2020.
Yeah, two things are happening right now. One, as soon as you talk about the carbon tax, most people's eyes glaze over. I mean, it's not really an interesting topic, and most people don't understand how it works. Second, right now, if you listen to the media, it's all about the vaccine. It's all about COVID. And so it got lost into the noise, really. And that's why most people aren't necessarily aware of what's happening with the carbon tax.
Do you think that was planned?
I think the Liberals have smart people working for the party. I assume that they know exactly what they're doing, and I would put $2 on the table and bet that there's going to be an election in the spring. So Mr. Trudeau
I'm not
gets
taking
the
that
majority.
bet.
I would bet $2 on that.
I'm not taking the bet. Not a chance. I always like talking to our next guest because I have, as we've said many times, huge respect for him as a professional, as an investigative journalist. He's one of the very best, and he's fearless, and he takes on issues and organizations lots of people would shy away from. They'd say, give this to somebody else, please. I'm talking about Sam Cooper, national online journalist, investigative with Global News, and Sam joins us on his Global News story this week, which is just incredible. It's like a James Bond movie that develops, or a script that develops you, but it's real and it's going on in this country right now. The headline of the story is alleged RCMP mole accused of selling secrets to kingpin money launderer and terror financiers network. If that's not going to get to your attention, few things will. How are you, Sam?
Doing great. Thanks for having me, boy.
Yeah, it's always great to have you on the show. So let me start. So I worked my way through your story, and it really reads like a spy thriller. Let's go back to October 2014, in the beginning of your piece. What happened in that month involving the US DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, and Canadian intelligence leaders?
It was an amazing meeting, really. And just as a bit of background, I have been getting into organized crime through casinos in British Columbia and slowly found out month by month that really it's so international, the level of the criminals involved. I started to develop sources around the world as I found out about this global network. So what happened in late 2014, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration invited the RCMP among Canada's Five Eyes intelligence allies down to Virginia, and they had an action plan. They wanted to target a man called Altaf Kanani, who is based in Pakistan and really one of the world's worst and most powerful criminals, estimated to be laundering about $15 billion per year for many terrorist organizations and many transnational drug cartels, especially based in China, Mexico, Colombia, and the Middle East. And the DEA's thesis and plan was simple. At the highest levels of crime in the world, the terrorists and organized crime, drug cartels work together in some ways and very often have their money laundered together. So to get to the point, the DEA wanted to go after Kanani because he was active around the world, and especially, very shockingly, in Canadian cities such as Toronto and Montreal. And so the DEA asked the RCMP to join this plan. Kanani was using currency trading shops in Toronto to launder drug cash, especially in Toronto and Montreal, and move that money around the world for cartels and terrorists through a form of underground banking, an ancient form known as Hawala.
Yeah, and Canada was, as you're right, becoming a major funding source for Hezbollah, which is designated as a foreign terrorist organization by this country. Sam, when you talk about laundering $15 billion in a year, that's $15,000 million a year laundering it. There must be very few individuals, very few organizations that have the criminal capacity to do that.
Exactly right. For the U.S. government, who have studied these global supercriminals for decades, they believed probably only about 5 people in the world had the organizations that were laundering that amount of money. And to do that, as one of my sources said, you basically have to have the reach of a Big 5 Canadian bank. You have to be tied into banks around the world, and you have to have that ability to collect drug cash from Western cities, really, where the big drug markets are, and move the cash wherever the drug cartels or the terrorists want you to move it. And so Altaf Kanani from a list of about 150 bad guys that the U.S. government believed that the Five Eyes should be targeting. He was up there in that top 5, and again, very active in ways that 99% of Canadians, or more than that, would have no idea. Very active in some forms of banking, underground banking in Canada.
Yeah. Now, there was a third angle in this triangle, which turns out to be someone we've heard a fair bit about recently in Canada, although we may not know, by and large, most of us, what role he plays or roles he played, and that's still being investigated and found out, and you'll be the first one to know, I'm sure. But this is Cameron Ortis, who had his own interest in Kanani. Talk to us about that, please.
That's right, Cameron Ortis, the alleged RCMP mole, another story, a spy story that I believe shocks Canadians, and if they're not shocked, they need to be jolted somehow. The allegations against Ortiz are about 9 national security charges shrouded in secrecy. What we at Global News did in this story, this case against Mr. Ortiz has been sitting there for about a year. We found out the nature of the charges against him. The most serious ones involve this Altaf-Kanani network. A little background on Ortis. He's a graduate of the UBC. He's an academic, University of British Columbia, an academic that rose like a rocket in RCMP intelligence just based on really his brilliance. He had a groundbreaking thesis on the connection between cyber criminals, states, and organized crime. And guess what? It looks like he exploited, his world-leading knowledge on those connections and was looking for a way to profit. And so what my story really did this week was explain the nature of the charges where the RCMP and the DEA were targeting Kanani and his currency traders in Toronto. Ortis was a high-level intelligence official, and according to the charges, he leaked the RCMP's plans targeting Kanani and these massive, money laundering networks in Toronto and Montreal. And so this would be my comment, but you really cannot imagine a more serious allegation of corruption and compromise if you're a Canadian official selling secrets to one of the world's biggest money launderers and terror financiers with very strong links to Hezbollah, an organization involved in moving drugs around the world, very close to the Iranian, people would call the brutal Iranian regime, and very growing in power in Canada. And, it's alleged that Ortiz was trying to help this organization.
Yeah, it's just amazing because, cliche notwithstanding, he was playing both ends against the middle, right?
Based on
to his personal benefit.
Exactly. We don't know what the Canada's prosecutors are going to allege about motive, but what I have found through talking to confidential sources is that the motive seems to have been profit. He was seeking, allegedly, big money from targets of the RCMP. And it seems to get worse than that because Canada, of course, is sharing intelligence with our trusted allies to go after these super criminals. And Ortiz betraying, allegedly, Canada's allies and selling this intelligence for his own profit. And I want to say that we've contacted Mr. Ortiz's lawyer a number of times trying to get any comment for this story about the detailed allegations we're reporting on. There was no response, and the allegations haven't been proven in court.
Jim sends an email to Roy at roygreenshow.com. Roy, who's going to play Sam in the movie? Regards, Jim. Sam Cooper, of course, is who Jim is referencing, national online journalist, investigative, Global News. Sam, I thought I answered Keanu Reeves could play you.
Matt Damon.
Matt Damon, sure, yeah. Whatever you like.
I do appreciate that comment. I am working on a book. I'm going to break the news to you today, Roy. So I think it's a book that's important for Canadians and the world, really. I'm looking at connections between organized crime and hostile states. So stay tuned.
Oh, I can't wait. I really can't wait. You have to give me the first interview.
Let's work on that.
Okay, let's work on that. Okay, Sam Cooper is with us, and he really is amazing. You are fearless in your reporting, and that's a very courageous endeavor because you tend to upset people with certain, those of us who, I don't do it as much as I used to, But we tend to upset people at times, and threats are not entirely uncommon when you annoy people who have a lot of power and a lot of influence and a lot of anger. So I'm not suggesting that's happened to you, but I would imagine there are certain people in Beijing who aren't too happy with you. Sam, so Kanani was arrested. Ortiz is arrested. Do we know what damage was done to Canada by Ortiz and this entire scheme?
Well, I talked to someone in the United States that should know very well. Of course, I can't name the person. This story is so sensitive. It's still before the courts. But the person said that knowing the Kanani investigation and how well the United States and Australia did by sharing intelligence and figuring out this network and trying to get drugs off the street, trying to stop guns from being moved around the world. This person said that people should be shocked and should say, what's alleged against Ortiz, if proven, this can never happen again in Canada because it's already hurt the national security of the Five Eyes because there's a freeze to some extent on that intelligence that's being shared to go after these super criminals that are so active in the cities that we live in. And so the damage is done. There's no question. And beyond that, another cliche here, the tip of the iceberg, I can tell you that Canada is still trying to assess how much information could have been leaked since 2007 when this brilliant young academic joined the RCMP. And we have 9 charges so far. I can tell you that Iran is not the only country where Mr. Ortiz might have forged unsavory ties with criminals. That is Iran, Pakistan, super criminals involved with cartels in Canada.
Wow. Let me just go back to what you said at the beginning. This Altaf Kanani and his organization in Pakistan, they laundered $15 billion a year. So they took 15 billion criminal dollars and laundered them through their various means in their underground banking system that's hundreds or maybe thousands of years old, and brought it out clean of the other side. So what a story. Sam, we have 3 minutes, and with all of the news now about the delays as far as Pfizer vaccine rollout is concerned, you did such an incredible job with your investigative work on the CanSino deal. Mr. Trudeau signed that in April of last year. By August, we had China saying, we're out of this, and they turned their backs on Canada. What do we need to remember about that particular situation?
Well, we need to remember that Canada, for some reason, placed a big bet on China and cooperation with China in developing a vaccine. In some ways, it might not have looked like a bad idea. This company in China, CanSino, was built by brilliant Chinese doctors and scientists trained in Canada with a lot of links in Canada. And so it would have seemed that they'd be comfortable working with Canadian doctors and scientists to develop the CanSino vaccine, which was based upon Canadian technology. Canada made a deal to share that technology, and for some reason, early in the spring, it seemed things started to go wrong, and China did not want to ship the promised vaccine that was developed to Canada. What my latest story showed was actually some of this problem probably could have been foreseen. If people were listening to intelligence, if people were looking ahead, they'd know that the scientists at CanSino are actually connected to Chinese talent recruiting programs, which are said to be used by the Chinese Communist Party to suck technology out of the West. It's called the 1,000 Talents Plan. And my story showed these direct links from these CanSino executives. And I want to say that I reached out to CanSino asking for comments about their ties to this plan, which is now really under attack by Western intelligence agencies. We didn't get a response, and I would like to hear their side of the story. But the deal, in hindsight, looks horrible. And as I said, if you're looking ahead, I think Canadian bureaucrats and leaders probably could have made their bets in better places than China and CanSino Biologics.
Yeah, given the relationship, or the lack of a relationship that exists and existed even last year between this country and China, with the Chinese ambassadors to Canada constantly attacking us and using language that was decidedly undiplomatic, we had other options, other choices than CanSino, but the deal was made and the deal fell through, and here we are struggling along sort of in the middle of the pack as far as vaccine development, or at least vaccine distribution is concerned. Sam, thank you so much for the time. Always really appreciate speaking with you. Thanks for the scoop on the book. Can't wait.
Thanks, Roy.
All the best. Sam Cooper, and at Scooper Cooper is Sam's handle on Twitter, at Scooper Cooper. He truly is one of the very, very best. He's unique, fearless reporter, and just is able to explain situations that develop, the most complex of situations, in manners that even I can understand. And the story that Sam has on Global News this week, this one we were talking to him about, you can just Google alleged RCMP mole. If you just use those words, you'll find it. But the full title is Alleged RCMP mole accused of selling secrets to kingpin money launderer and terror financiers network. Sam Cooper.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. If you want to hear more, subscribe to The Roy Green Show on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you find your favorites. And if you like what you hear, leave us a review and tell a friend. I'm Roy Green. Have a great weekend.